another few minutes before we actually begin the webinar, just to make sure that everyone is connected and can access the webinar. So, you know, just hang on for another few minutes and we will be right back with you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. Just wanted to give you a quick update. One of our presenters is running a little bit late due to the weather in town today. So please bear with us for another 7 to 8 minutes, and then we'll get started. Sorry for the delay. We'll be right back with you. Thank you. Hi, everyone. All right, we're going to get started. We're still waiting for one of the presenters, but we figured we could do some of the introductory stuff while we're waiting for her to get here. So thank you for joining us for today's coalition briefing. My name is Sarah Medeiros, and I'm the Communications and External Affairs Assistant here at the National Women's Law Center. So a few technical notes before we begin. All attendee lines will be on mute during the actual presentation part of the briefing, and then we will unmute at the end for Q&A, and we'll let you know when that's happening. The webinar, as you should be able to see now on your screens, will have live captioning throughout. PDFs of the slides are available to you now as a handout in the GoToWebinar system, as well as a couple other handouts that we've provided for you. And just so you're aware, the webinar will be recorded. At this time, I'd like to turn it over to Gretchen Borchelt.
Hi, everybody. It's Gretchen Borchelt with the National Women's Law Center. Thank you all for joining us today. And perfect timing, the last presenter just walked in the door. Sorry to the folks who aren't in DC or who didn't leave their offices, but the weather made traffic a little bad out there. So sorry we're getting things started a little late. So I think we could go around and at least say who's in the room. I think we're not going to have everybody on the webinar do it because, well, we can see who you are, and we have you on mute. So why don't we just go around so people know who's in the room, and then we'll get started with the presentations. Go ahead, Elise.
I'm Louise. I'm with the National Women's Law Center.
Juliana Schulman-Laniel with the National Partnership for Women and Families.
Alex Baptiste with the National Partnership for Women and Families.
Abby Miller from the National Women's Health Network. Olivia Lyman from the National Women's Health Network.
Jocelyn Mraku from the National Women's Health Network.
Carter Bell with the Rockefeller Family Fund.
Teresa Lau with the National Women's Law Center.
Julie Hutkin from Global Strategy Group.
PerryUndem from PerryUndem.
Dana Singheiser with Planned Parenthood.
Rachel Kane with Planned Parenthood.
Medora Vonsel with Emily's List.
Gabrielle Stopper with Planned Parenthood.
Okay, so that is who's in the room here, and we know we have a lot of folks joining by webinar, so thank you all. So some of you have gotten a little bit of a preview of some of these messages, but just to kind of set the context here, this is Gretchen speaking again. We in Planned Parenthood talked probably in spring saying, hey, you know, this vacancy could happen. We know that there were rumors of Kennedy retiring. We knew that the end of the term was coming up. And we thought, maybe we should test this and find out what's going on with the court and people's reactions to it and what it would mean to lose Kennedy. And we knew abortion would be a big part of that story. So we started doing some of the prep work. And as some folks know, we did some online focus groups before there was even a Kennedy vacancy. 2 weeks before Kennedy announced his retirement, we were doing online focus groups. And then boom, we had the retirement announcement, and we were able to pivot quickly and add some Kavanaugh specific questions to the survey, and we went out in the field just a couple of days after Kavanaugh was nominated. So it was all good timing. It was very fortuitous, unfortunately, but we have to deal with this. But we're really excited to share all of the results with you. And as Dana keeps saying, and other presentations we've done, we have the dream team of Tressa and Julie, who really bring both. Tressa brings kind of the substantive expertise on abortion, and I know has done a lot of abortion and repro polling with a lot of groups who are represented here. And Julie really brings the kind of Hill strategy and strategic thinking in terms of talking to folks on the Hill that we really wanted to make sure was part of this. So a great team. Dana, you might want to say something to add to that. Yeah.
Thank you. One finding I just wanted to preview that I just think is particularly timely, which is that people really want to know who this guy is and what he thinks, and they want straight answers. And I just think that is, number one, consistent with a successful message that the Democrats are driving right now about the lack of transparency and availability of documents related to Judge Kavanaugh's service in the federal government. And number two, I think it's a good sort of finding to keep in mind as we all start to think about the hearings and the opportunity that presents. So I think those two things together really provide some opportunity that we look forward to working with everyone on in the coming weeks. And secondly, I just wanted to do a plug for recess, because even as we're all sitting here in Washington, we know that there's probably 6 states that are going to determine whether we are successful in blocking Judge Kavanaugh. And there are 2 actions that everyone can participate in that are coalition-wide across the country. One, on August 8th is the National Day of In-District Senate Senate visits, it rolls right off the tongue. Again, August 8th, National Day of In-District Senate visits. So we are encouraging all of our supporters, other coalition partners I know are doing the same, to just show up at their Senate offices to make their voices heard. To the extent they cannot physically do that, they have a second bite at the apple the next day on August 9th, which will be the National Day of Senate Calls. So I'm sure everyone will be buried in emails about these two activities in the next 24, 48 hours, but I just wanted to make sure that they were on your radar screens to really, I think they're good low threshold ways for all of our supporter networks to plug in a meaningful way next week while folks are in recess. And with that, let me turn it over to the Dream Team.
Okay. I will just probably jump right in with methods. Gretchen said, yeah, so Gretchen was like, oh, timing was fortuitous. For our perspective, it was not, because we had to write this questionnaire in 2 days and field it and have results within. And we at first we proposed like a robust study. We're going to do it in English and Spanish, and that had to go out the window because things happen so quickly. But we did a survey, a pretty large survey, almost 3,000 likely voters. Again, this came after focus groups with mostly moderate Republican and independents. We did have some strong Democrats in that qualitative research. One purpose of this survey was to bring up some numbers up to the Hill and show members of Congress there's a lot of support here and do some messaging there. So that's why there was a focus a little bit on Republican and independent voters. We did oversamples of between 300 and 400 Black voters, Latinx voters, and API voters. This was fielded July 11th through the 20th, and we used online sample through Civis Analytics. So I'm going to start with just a couple big findings, turn over to Julie to talk about more of the political stuff, and then come back around and we'll end with some of the messaging stuff. First of all, not surprisingly, as with most issues, Trump is out of step with voters on this issue. 73% think that Trump is going to nominate a conservative nominee, but only 39% of voters want a conservative nominee. On the next slide, when we look at, and you'll hear me say throughout, there's not a lot of differences, especially in messaging by race or party ID, a little bit there, but one thing that stood out was Latinx voters were a little bit more uncertain. They were a little bit less likely to think that Trump was going to nominate a conservative justice. So that's just a flag to me. There may be a little bit more education needed among Latinx voters, maybe a little bit more informing and really hammering in that this is going to be a conservative nominee. 44% of white voters want a conservative nominee. Only 31% of Latinx, 32% of API voters want one, and only 22% of Black voters. Throughout all the data, by the way, Black voters are like on most progressive issues, they are the strongest supporters. They pop nearly everywhere on that. On all the messages, Black voters are, the messages are powerful, especially among Black voters. Okay, just on Roe v. Wade, I think you all have probably seen these numbers. 7 in 10 do not want to overturn Roe v. Wade. By race, that's 81% of Black respondents, 78% of API respondents, 70% of Latinx, and 69% of white respondents. And turn it over to Julie to talk about breakdowns by party ID and some of our other questions around.
Great, thank you. So, I think just to underscore Tressa's point that this is sort of broadly the sentiment among voters, what we see here as we look across parties is that, as expected, Democrats are quite protective of Roe. 87% don't want to see it overturned, but likewise, 75% of independents and, nearly half, 49% of Republicans say they do not want to see Roe overturned. What is interesting is that the folks in the sort of overturned bucket among Republicans, that is something that's really driven by very conservative Republicans. Moderate Republicans actually tend to look much more akin to independents, with nearly 3/4 of moderate Republicans saying that they do not want to see Roe overturned. you know, we've been talking a lot about this sort of notion of risk and whether or not abortion rights are at risk. And what you can see here again across the political spectrum is that there is this sense that the right to have an abortion is at risk. Of course, most pronounced among Democrats, but again, nearly half of Republicans and half of independents also kind of, you know, are sort of rallying around this sense that abortion is at risk. As Tressa said, Black voters tend to feel this more intensely than others, 66% saying they believe, you know, the right to have an abortion is at risk compared to 58% overall. What is sort of particularly relevant at this moment in time is how intense these feelings are in the context of the conversation around the Supreme Court nomination and Kavanaugh specifically. And when we look at sort of people's sense that a Trump appointee, Kavanaugh, would impact, you know, the court's position on Roe, right? Meaning how likely is it that the court would overturn Roe, but also how likely is it that the court would rule to restrict women's access to abortion? What we see here is that broad majorities, right? So 3/4 of voters across the board believe that it is more likely than not that if Trump successfully appoints a new justice, Roe is at risk, and also that it is likely that the court will really rule to restrict women's access to abortion. So again, I think this just speaks to the intensity and the sense of sort of risk and you know, the immediacy with which people feel these things could be impacted by a Trump nominee. This is a great slide for a bunch of reasons, I think particularly instructive on language, and Tressa will get to this a bit more on the back half of the presentation, but we wanted to understand sort of how we make this personally relevant to voters. That's always sort of the thing we're thinking about. How do you make it tangible? How can you personalize an issue for voters in a way that is very resonant with them? And so we asked about how important is it to voters personally that a new justice rule to uphold the following. And these are sort of similar issues, but talked about in different ways. And so the first ask was Roe v. Wade. The second was women's access to safe legal abortion. And the third was how important is it that a new justice rule to uphold women's constitutional rights, including abortion. And what is, again, not surprising is that for Democrats, these are all quite resonant, right? You see with intensity that across the board, Democrats believe it is important that justice uphold Roe, access to safe legal abortion, and this sort of broader notion of women's constitutional rights, including abortion. What is very interesting is that as we look at independents and also Republicans, when you talk about what is sort of at stake here, and when you talk about what may be kind of resonant and gain traction among these independent and Republican voters, you see that women's constitutional rights, including abortion, is the thing that is personally important to 8 of 10 independents, 6 of 10 Republicans. So that's sort of a significant notion as you're looking to broaden the pool beyond kind of core group of Democrats and maybe bring independents and moderate Republicans to a place where they feel engaged in the conversation. You know, similarly, as we look at this among different audiences by race, you see here that white voters, again, sort of have a more outsized emphasis on this notion of women's constitutional rights, including abortion, which is not surprising given that those voters tend to be more moderate than Democratic voters who tend to be Black, Latina, African American voters, API, right? For those folks, there's not huge differentiation when you are talking about this, but certainly among white voters, again, who may tend to be more moderate, there's value in that sort of terminology and phraseology of women's constitutional rights, including abortion. I think the one thing I would add here is that when you think about the politics and the folks on the Hill, I think this is not just sort of helpful for them proactively, but also important to underscore that it is safe for them to talk explicitly about abortion, particularly when they're talking about it in the context of women's constitutional rights. So for those members who are trying to sort of sift through this, that's a helpful finding. In terms of the political opportunity, what we see here is that there is sort of a real opportunity when you think about what a candidate has to gain by supporting rights on abortion. You can see here 80% of Democrats say they are more likely to support a candidate running for Congress who supports a woman's rights on abortion, as do 50% of independent voters and nearly a third of Republicans. So really much more to be gained than to be lost here by communicating to voters that you are a candidate who supports women's rights on abortion. When we look at, again, the breakout by race, you see here that African-American voters, as Tressa said, sort of over-index on many of these issues. As you can see, 72% say they're more likely to support a candidate who supports women's rights on abortion. Latinx voters, slightly more moderated, as Tressa noted, stuff we saw elsewhere in the data, and white voters, but still majorities, and then API voters, 6 of 10. And then finally, we asked this question specifically, again, in the context of the Supreme Court, thinking about your senator voting to approve a new Supreme Court justice who would rule to uphold Roe v. Wade. You can see here again that voters are inclined to give credit to a senator who would vote to approve a Supreme Court justice who explicitly would rule to uphold Roe. That's true of 74% of Democrats, nearly half, 47% of independents, and a third of Republicans, which, when you think about it in the context of partisanship, is quite significant, that 1 in 3 Republicans, support this notion and feel that they would be more likely to support a senator if they voted for a nominee who would uphold Roe.
Okay, so in the focus groups, we somewhere in the middle of the groups, we said, by the way, here's what Gorsuch said in his hearings about Roe v. Wade. And he said, I can't remember exactly verbatim, but it was like, Roe is the law of the land, I believe in precedent, blah, blah, blah. And we said, what do you think about that? What do you take from that? Oh, that's great. He's going to uphold Roe. He's for women's rights on abortion, blah, blah, blah. Okay. So then we said, well, here's what anti-abortion groups said about Gorsuch, and all of their praise. I can't remember the exact words, but about Gorsuch. And then voters were like, wait a second, what? Things change so fast. And we don't know what to believe now. So as Dana said, people do want to know the truth. They do want to know where he stands. Polling back in the Gorsuch days and prior, they do want to know where people stand on abortion, whatever. So there is a desire to actually know, and there's irritation and kind of anger when it's vague. So in the survey, we said, how important do you think it is that Kavanaugh talks about whether or not he believes the Constitution protects the individual right of all people to make personal decisions about their bodies, including the right to contraception and abortion? So across the board, 88% of these voters find that important. Across Democrats, independents, Republicans, as we said on the Hill, this is not risky to ask about. In fact, it's probably risky not to ask about. Voters do want to know about this. And again, across the board with race, we see, again, higher intensity with Black voters, but across the board. Next slide. So we asked this question, how concerned would you be if the Supreme Court nominee were described as any of these things? And the reason we asked this question is as a proxy to figure out, okay, if you have to boil it down, what are people really concerned about? Are they concerned about somebody being ultra-right, religious, activist judge, narrow-minded, old-fashioned, too political? What is it? The top two are anti-women and narrow-minded. And about 10% of respondents in the survey moved toward I'm sorry, I'm ignoring you guys, totally, I realize my back's to you. About 10% of respondents moved toward wanting to take action by the end of the survey. And among those, being concerned about anti-women is top 10 points higher than narrow-minded. And on the next slide, it's not just Democrats, it's independents, and it's Republicans as well. It's a top concern that the nominee is anti-women, and there's no, coincidence that Republicans know this as well. This is why in his speech, right, when he cited his daughters and everything else. For Republicans and independents, too political is, kind of the second tier there. The next slide, just by race as well, same thing. Top 2 and the top 1, anti-women. So I'll come back around to what that means for our recommendations. So you're not supposed to necessarily be able to read all these, but we had 3 sort of message batteries. One was on Kavanaugh's record. Does this make you feel more negative, more positive toward Kavanaugh? One was about just opposing his nomination, and one was around threats facing reproductive rights. So around Kavanaugh's record, the top 2 across the board is concern about feeling negative that he's ruled in favor of expanding government surveillance into people's phones and email records, that he's criticized the Affordable Care Act, and he might deny coverage for people for pre-existing conditions. Those are among the top 2. Then it goes down from there. And those top 2 also are pretty across the board. One slight difference we did see among race is Latinx voters were more, the difference between the government surveillance thing was a big deal, as a big reason, not surprising, to oppose or to feel more negative about Kavanaugh. And that was the difference between that and, say, birth control or restricting abortion was bigger than among other groups. Does that make sense? So still important about other groups, but that was just heightened among Latinx voters. We asked about, one last thing. When we looked at the people who shifted toward being more likely to take action, the ones in gray stood out as among the top concerns about Kavanaugh's record. So he argued that a boss's religious views override an individual's right to insurance coverage for birth control, and that he's ruled in past cases to restrict women's access to safe and legal abortion. So those are kind of the top 2 among people who shifted. So again, it's sort of this gender, birth control, abortion thing is what was shifting people. Okay, so we split sampled the survey. We had a huge sample size, so half the people got half of these messages, half got the other. There's about, 13-point difference between the top and the bottom, but it goes down pretty gradually. So a lot of these messages, this tells us there's a lot of flexibility. There's not just one message, there's a lot we can use. The top 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 are the ones that are pretty across the board, whether it's Democrats, independents, Republicans, white, Latinx, API, Black voters, across the board, they tend to be strong. So the top one to oppose is around healthcare, pre-existing conditions. Then this other one is, another one is that he's likely to rule against people's freedom and opportunity to control their lives at the most basic level, their bodies, their families, their life's path. And that's a message we've been did well like a year and a half ago in some of our other research, and so we keep testing it since we know it did really well, and again here on reproductive rights, but here as well, it was a strong message. Kavanaugh was chosen from a pre-screened list of judges who are already biased against women's constitutional rights on abortion, likely to rule in favor of government overreach. And then Kavanaugh if he rules to overturn Roe, women could be criminalized and punished in our country for having an abortion. So those were kind of the consistent top ones across the groups. One slight thing among API respondents, our children and grandchildren are likely to have fewer rights than us, kind of rose above the top more than across other groups. And that also among API respondents, that his record shows that Kavanaugh doesn't understand the impact of the court's decision on women and families. But all of those did pretty well. Should I give a shout out to our survey? Okay, because we also, in this really crunch time, with NAPOP, with the Latina Institute, with In Our Own Voice, National Women's Law Center, went into the field just as quickly. We wrote a questionnaire in one day. We only needed one day because we wrote this one maybe, but and we should be getting results on that survey next week. We're almost on the field. I should be getting data tomorrow. And that delves more into messaging, especially about how to make, as Julie said earlier, you got to make this personal. So in that survey, it's among Latinx voters, API, and Black voters. all who don't want to overturn Roe. So it's basically communities of color who don't want to overturn Roe, and how do we make this issue personal in a way that they're going to act. Anyway, so we're going to have more insights from that. Next slide.
And on this slide, I guess the other comment I would make is this was the criminalization message that NARAL has also tested with that. Just want to shout out their effort and their research before this one, that obviously the success of that message was reflected in our survey as well. So that's really strong across the board.
Yep. Yes. It's nice when two studies show the same thing. Okay, so as Julie said, voters think that abortion is at risk, especially Democrats, but half of Republicans and independents. They don't really know why, though. And you get into focus groups, they've heard about this, and they've heard about Iowa and Texas and something here and something there. And some people, finally I'm getting like one person in a group who knows a ton, and that person usually has seen John Oliver or Samantha Bee or something like that. But voters do not know, most voters know very little about this issue, and that's the #1 problem you face. So yes, there's a sense right now that there's at risk. People know that conservatives are in power. They know that conservatives want to overturn Roe. They are against abortion rights. So there's this feeling, there's this impression, but you really need to, your messaging really needs to inform people. So we tested this series of what's been going on and how reproductive rights are at risk. And again, you get half or more saying very concerned, they're feeling concerned about these things. The top one, and again, kind of across the board, since 2011, politicians have passed 400 new laws against abortion in 33 states across the country that shame, pressure, and punish women who have decided to have an abortion. Again, in other research, that tends to climb to the top, so this did too. Another one, at least states are poised to immediately seek to ban abortion if Roe v. Wade were overturned. And then the shaded ones, again, like on the persuadables who moved, it's informing them that the Supreme Court already allowed for-profit companies to deny employees coverage for birth control because of the owner's religious views, and then that the courts, under the Trump administration, the courts can be the last and only check. But this series, even though people feel that abortion is at risk, even though they sense that they don't think it's unlikely that Roe is going to be overturned, like 5 or 6 years ago, they would have, I think we would have seen half or more saying, no, it's not going to be overturned. So now we only see a quarter saying it's not. So it's there, but to get people to act and to get them on your side long term, you have to educate. So these points I think are really important. Anything else? Next slide. I forget. Okay. So recommendations. Overall, we think there's a lot going on right now on gender in the country. We're in a really different place than we were, obviously, 3 years ago. The fact that an anti-women candidate is the #1 concern across party ID, across respondents in our survey, we think that's the frame, that's the narrative that should lead this. It's not that you have to use women's rights, not that you have to use a ton of gendered language, but evoking that sense of this is an anti-women nominee. As Julie said, the language that works best for broad audiences, women's constitutional rights, including abortion. That's where you see white people a little bit edge up. That's where you see especially independents and Republicans. More liberal voters, access to abortion. Obviously, we need to be talking about access, not just the right. And among liberal voters, Democrats, that does just as good, if not a little bit better, than women's constitutional rights. Describing the seat, don't use swing vote, deciding vote, single vote. Those are vague terms. They're not descriptive of an outcome. So deciding vote, well, he could decide the right way. So instead, talk about this seat as turning the balance of the court against women's constitutional rights, including abortion. Very descriptive. People know exactly what you're saying there. And in the research, there was a very clear difference between those terms. Key messages, so turning the balance of the court against women's constitutional rights, talking about Kavanaugh's record of arguing against access to abortion, access to birth control, and health care. President Trump has promised to only nominate justices who would overturn Roe. That helps. Voters know that Trump follows through on his promises, so that helps inform people and give that, give an extra sense of, oh, this is a big deal. And then if Kavanaugh rules to overturn Roe v. Wade, women could be criminalized and punished in our country. On the next slide, as we get further into this debate, my sense is that, tell me if you disagree, Julie. My sense is that his record is going to become more and more important in messaging on that. Voters want to know. You have to show them, don't just tell them. If your messaging just says, oh, he's anti-women, in one ear out the other, doesn't mean anything. If you have to specifically and repeatedly talk about his record on anything that relates to women, for sure restricting access to abortion, for sure birth control. There are things around healthcare, and then anything else that surfaces that we can connect to women in any way.
Yeah, and I mean, I think to Dana's point, right, you can feel this building, right, in terms of putting pressure to sort of have people ask and have him answer where he is on lots of these things, but also this appetite to understand exactly what his sort of point of view is on these things. That is clearly building. So I think all of these are good proof points and very tangible things to sort of wrap in this moment right now too.
Good. And then educating voters, just those things I was talking about before, those proof points and informing voters. What's at stake message, this was again one of the top ones. You could probably switch in some of the other ones, but this is the one again that tends to test over and over, tests really well about people's freedom and opportunity. On explaining his views, again, the recommendation is, and this is what we did in the survey where everybody agrees, that he must declare whether he believes the Constitution protects the rights of people to make these decisions. On the next slide, the last point I'll make is graphics are really important. Images are very important. I still hear in focus groups people talking about that image of 13 men around the table talking about Obamacare. White men, remember that? So that sticks in people's mind, and people care about this issue because they still care about this issue. Number one, because it's about women's rights. That's just what we hear over and over again. That's the number one. And that tends to be about autonomy, control, and my body and my decision. It's just kind of what we keep hearing over and over again. It also relates to economic issues and being able, whether you even have a choice, and a bunch of other things. But the women's rights thing tends to be over and over what we hear. When you put a picture of all these men in front of people, I knew among Democrats, we did this in the focus group, I knew Democrat voters would be like outraged and totally get the gender thing. I didn't know whether independent or Republicans are. We did this kind of online thing where people rated everybody else's responses. So you could kind of see like, oh, this guy's response got the top rating and this woman's response got the top rating, right? So when I look at what was most, so the question was, what do you take away from this? And then among Republicans, one of the top answers was, we're in trouble. Among independents, verbatim, we're in trouble. Exact same phrase. Among Democrats, we're all screwed. And then underneath that, all the gender stuff came up. Even among, now again, these were moderate Republicans, so it doesn't represent all Republicans by any means, but they were like, we need some more female people. We need, we need to elect more women to office. It's very motivating. So this is the issues about women's rights, but this power and this feeling, this is kind of where they go. Also after women's rights, and they learn what's going on, and then they're like, wait a second, who's making these laws and whatever? And you get that in front of them, and it just sticks. So that worked really well. The last graphic we tested, we had big ambitions about also exploring messaging around lower courts, but that is probably too big talking about lower courts. But we did test this graphic that, again, nobody really knows what's going on with lower courts. So we kind of described, here's the court system. Here are all these restrictions going. happening, and there'll be these cases that'll work their way up. And then on this side, the green little things are the judges that Trump is going to replace. And again, we have the pictures of, especially with the conservatives, mostly men. But this does a lot of work for people, and we said, you know, what questions do you have after reading this? And I expected questions like confusion about the courts or confusion about something, and we got questions like, yeah, tell me what can I do? You know, how do I get involved? You know, those were the questions. Trying to think if there's anything else. Do y'all feel like we covered it?
Yeah.
All right.
So let's open it up to questions. We're going to unmute the people who are called in so they can ask questions too. And of course, anybody in the room, if you have questions for Tressa or Julie, please, now's the time.
And while folks are getting their questions ready, having done enough of these panels, I wanted to call your attention to the interested parties memo that we put out also. What we did after we had all these findings, and we're sort of certain about the top results, is we quickly put out a short survey with the intention of releasing it publicly. So that's what this memo is designed to do. It's really just a confirmation of everything that you heard, but put in a format that we can all use with reporters. So that's what those numbers are. So, you know, all of the message briefing and in-depth research is we want to share it as widely and broadly as possible to really inform all of us and make sure we're talking about the nomination in the most effective way. But with respect to talking with reporters and citing statistics, the memo, you should draw on that memo where we have released all of the crosstabs as reporters require you to do when you ask them to cover polling numbers.
Okay, so since we've now entered the Q&A portion of the webinar, if you would like to ask a question, if you could please use the dashboard along the side, your GoToWebinar dashboard to raise your hand. And when I see a raised hand, I will unmute you specifically just to make sure we're avoiding sort of extra noise and everyone talking all at once. So I see a raised hand right now. Era, I've just unmuted you. You should be live.
Hi, this is Eliane Ramos from the Latina Institute. Are we going to get a copy of these PowerPoints?
Yes, so they're available to you right now through the GoToWebinar system. You can download it using via PDF, as well as 2 other handouts that are relevant to the presentation. And we'll also send around a link to the PDF as well afterwards.
Okay, thank you. And is this something that we can share with the larger audience, or do you want to keep it just to the group that is here?
So it is to inform allies who are active in the SCOTUS fight. So that would mean, you know, not reporters and not opponents, obviously. But if you are working closely with other coalition partners who you think would benefit from this messaging, just let us know so we kind of know where it's being sent out to. And but it's intended to be shared. We just sort of with those guardrails.
Okay.
Was there someone in particular you wanted to share it with?
No, but we are part of different coalitions, and so I was wondering whether or not we could share it to other people that might be interested in information here.
Yeah. Great.
But thank you.
Okay. Sorry, let me go back to unmute again. But all right, I don't see any other hands up online. Do we have any other questions in the room?
Does it feel accessible? Does it feel like language and like an approach that works and feels comfortable? We're getting nods in the room, so I know folks on the phone can't. But if you disagree, definitely jump in with your, however you do that online.
Right, so I'm going to give one last call. Please raise your hand digitally using the GoToWebinar system, which usually pops up on the right side of your screen. If you have any questions, and I will unmute you. Going once, going twice. Gretchen, I'll hand it over to you.
Well, thank you, everybody. Thanks to the folks who came in person and braved the rain, which is still happening. And thanks to Tressa and Julie for spending the time and briefing everybody so comprehensively that no one had any questions. And we will certainly, Tressa and the other groups that she mentioned, we'll be back in touch as we finish our survey on communities of color to share that with you all. And just let us know if you have any follow-up questions about this polling, and we're excited for you all to use it.
Thank you.
All right, we're going to disconnect.
Thanks.
Bye, everybody.
Thanks for joining us today, everybody.